with Owei Lakemfa on Citizen 93.7 FM Abuja. Today, we have a big, like they say in Nigeria, big masquerade. We have a man of ideas. He sleeps and eats ideas. He's Professor Udenka. You're welcome, sir.
It's a pleasure, Owei, comrade, to be with you this morning.
Thank you very much. Professor Udenka was a senior lecturer in the School of Humanities, Abia State University, Uturu, in 1998, when he was plucked out by General Sani Abacha and detained. That was not his first detention.
No.
He had been in detention at least 4 other times before, but this one was more serious. However, General Sani Abacha passed away, and a month after that, Udenka and others were freed by General Abdulsalami Abubakar. So it was some stroke of luck.
Sure, comrade, it was. Those were very interesting days.
Like I said, the Professor Udenka is a man of ideas. Just in 2019, he uploaded on the rest of us 21 books at one time. 21 books. Yeah. Talking about his childhood, about philosophy, about aesthetics. So he produced that. But he's somebody who is a specialist on democracy, on peace building.
Yeah.
He's also, well, I said he was detained by Abacha. It wasn't for nothing. He was actually one of the leaders of the Eastern Mandate Union, the opposed military regime. He was the leader of the NADECO, the National Coalition, the Democratic Coalition. And when we returned to civil rule, he was the founding Secretary General of the Alliance for Democracy, AD.
Yes.
He had also been the Director of Internal Conflict Resolution in the Institute of Peace and Conflict Resolution in Abuja. So you're welcome, sir.
It's a pleasure, comrade.
We're going to talk about Africa. Since you are an expert on Africa, on NEPAD, on AU, and but first, before I go there, for those of us who have known you over the years, we know you are the Secretary General of the Marxist Youth Movement in the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. Yeah. That was in the early 80s.
Early 80s.
Yes.
82 and 83.
82, 83. I'm wondering whether you are still the same person or you have potted.
Comrade, it's a pleasure being with you this morning and then responding to this very exciting question, specifically of my background or history, as a student, radical student activist of the Marxist, bent. I recall a conversation I had much later, maybe 2010, 2012, with one of the guiding lights of our struggle, who was a staff advisor of the socialist movement in UNN, University of Nigeria, in the person of Professor Odemamwala. In his office in Abuja, he said, comrade, upon reflection, do you think we are not just Marxists? That even the way we designed the program, the institutional and administrative structuring of the movement and the program reflected Stalinist rigidification of Marxism, which means we never had a president of the movement, a secretary general, like you have of the KOPSU, the then Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Then you have a secretary of ideological classes and political education and so on, reflecting our unalloyed and unabashed borrowing or mimicry. When we were student activists or student Marxists, we were compared to believe in the existence of a path of Marxism that is authentic, only one single path that is authentic and legitimate, meaning the Soviet path, because the triumph of communism in Soviet Union under the guidance of Lenin. So Marxism-Leninism, as conjoined words, became a reflection of the solidity, authenticity, and legitimacy of the Marxist canon. That means anything else was to be delegitimized. So when Gorbachev came calling, in an era one Marxism or several Marxisms, who is there to say, I am the most powerful interpreter of Maoism? Why did we stop at Maoism? Why could have been Marxism, Leninism, Maoism to Nkrumahism or Fanonism? So in a sense, one has to begin to reevaluate the founding norms of the ideological beliefs and compositions and begin to become increasingly more broad-minded in terms of my appreciation of Marxism and its future. So finally, why in terms of thinking and as a scholar and writing as a scholar, the Marxist dialectical method can have nuanced my understanding summit of African leaders that commenced the transition from OAU to AU. And I was in that Durban as part of President Obasanjo's delegation, being a director in the Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution that was then housed in the presidency. So I witnessed firsthand the interplay of forces and the maneuver or your epistemic gear in terms of knowledge, formulation for Africa from OAU. There was a decolonial movement to AU that was composed to be a practical, political, and economic and developmental initiative. So AU's birth was to signal the beginning of an African century in terms of political resuscitation, environmental renewal, poverty reduction, conflict mitigation, etc. And then 3 key elements were to shepherd this. One, the institution of the heads of state themselves had a new ingredient embedded in it called the African peer review mechanism, which was not present in OAU. That means, how do we as leaders hold ourselves accountable? How do we as peers say, you are doing very well in this regard? My brother president, you're not doing well in this regard. Why is a country being racked by poverty, disease, and hunger, and so on? The peer review mechanism, we can, in the course of this conversation, know whether it has worked in the past 20-something years and to what extent. Second is NEPAD, what they call the New Partnership for African Development, which flew from what they call the Omega Plan and MAP, the MAP, Million African Program. So these two combined to create a new sense of urgency for African, dramatic, developmental transformation by building partnerships between Africa as a continent and the globe, between African institutions and global institutions, between the public sector and the private sector, between citizens and those who lead them. And then the final one is the African mechanism in fashioning an African peace and security architecture at the AU Secretariat in Addis Ababa. How then if we are going to hold our leaders accountable? We're going to drive development using NEPAD. How about if conflict overwhelms Africa? What kind of architecture do we have where we can mainstream peace and security issues? That became very well grounded in AU, and then the regional communities, like ECOWAS, etc., SADC, and so on, were encouraged to develop their own mechanism. But ECOWAS, another subject for another day, had already a well-developed template for peace engagement in terms of peacekeeping, peace enforcement, if you look at ECOMOG and so on. 20-something odd years, Africa has underwhelmed. The African century, which was to be heralded by NEPAD, by AU, NEPAD, etc., they didn't bear the kind of fruits we expected them to bear. And I'm sure that, Comrade Owei, you have a lot to ask in terms of why this, we are to be so.
Yeah, you're on the topic already. The question is why? Because I remember that Gaddafi was pushing for a union of African states.
Yeah.
Now, in your assessments, at that historical occasion where you were present, do you think that was a good move, or it was a move that was defeated and Africa was defeated?
It was not like a new move. If you look at the grand masters of African or Pan-Africanism, Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Sekou Touré, and Amilcar Cabral, the rest of them, Augustino Neto and so on, Patrice Lumumba, their vision was a grand vision of African renaissance. They didn't see the tiny ethnic compositions of Africa. They saw the sweep, almost like the mini global sweep of African majestic history and peoples. That means they wanted to build a single African state, if possible. So that project was a project of decolonization, which means the only way to recover from the colonial enterprise of exploitation and economic exploitation and political subjugation and oppression was to now build not just individual African states, but to build a collective African nation and people. That means break down the boundaries, artificial boundaries across Africa, and then leverage on our own old ancestral claims to development to fashion a new modern Africa. So Gaddafi came at a much later stage there to carry on this kind of mandate, this kind of vision. The downside of it was that a lot of people accused Gaddafi of having lacks of theoretical and philosophical formulation and more of the practical economic means with which to realize his dream. That means if money is going to help in shaping Africa into a new collective, unified order, I have the resources to do that. And he really spent a lot of money and resources in trying to channel African energy in that direction. But it was a project dead on arrival, not because Gaddafi lacked the theoretical resources or philosophical underpinning of his own gamble, but because Africa was already contaminated by the intrusiveness of the police. That means the metropolitan powers in Europe, the imperial nations of the West, had already eaten deep into the fabric of African unity. And many African states were not self-sufficient and self-reliant. That means they relied on the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and other financial institutions across the West to support them. Some African countries have their budgets prepared, not in Africa, but prepared elsewhere in Europe. That means if you can't even generate internal resources and revenue, to match 60, 40, 50% of your budget, you require the rest as loans or graft or aids. There's no way you can talk about unity of Africa. And when we did the Francophone segment of Africa, it is a sorry story, even till today. You have to sift through the propaganda, to sift through the objective truth, which I'm still searching through. To what extent are these countries genuinely decolonized states, genuinely post-colonial states? Or to what extent are they still are tied to the apron strings of French imperial design, even in the post-colonial moment? To what extent is the economy free from this overweening, asphyxiating grip by French, post-colonial, suzerainty? So there are many issues there. You look and say the African Union, African Unity Project was dead on arrival in terms of even again the artificiality of many African states, the intrusiveness of the Western world, the deep embedment of the Francophone African segment into the French economic, political, and cultural system, and most importantly, the inability of these frameworks, the NEPAD, the AU, and the peer review mechanism to deliver on its set objectives.
Thank you very much, Prof. This is Diplomatic Hour with Owei Lakemfa on Citizen 93.7 FM Abuja. And we're speaking with Professor Udenka, a man who is widely traveled with also wide knowledge also. So Prof, so how will you situate Africa today? How will you...
Well, it's a very tough one, comrade, but we'll just about try. How many factors are really implicated in African underdevelopment? Because it is annoying to speak of African underdevelopment, some 50, sometimes 60 odd years of post-colonial governance. Some people implicate even the founding of the nation states of Africa, what Basil Davidson will call the cause of the nation states. That means the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. That happened a year or two after Marx had died. In essence, Marx anticipated imperialism, but he didn't really see the full flow of capital becoming imperial. That was left for angels and ultimately Lenin to really understand. And so you can implicate that colonial enterprise of dividing or destructuring and recomposing African states as it pleases them. So there was not organic African nations coming together as a part of the history and civilization, so that today we don't have, more than 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe Ethiopia and a few others could be exception to this rule, where you don't find colonial states now parading as post-colonial entities. People believe that is one of the drawbacks on African development. Some people are telling you, again, another segment of colonial intrusion is colonialism itself and what it planted into the African space. Became equally one of the factors that has troubled and continues to trouble African development. But for me, at a more philosophical level, scholars have talked about decolonization and the post-colonial, theories of African emancipation and so on. But for me, I'm finding some value in a new construct, not exactly new, Latin American construct that has now pervaded the discourse spaces in Africa, in Asia, in fact, in the global South. You find in Asia a work such as Asia's Method, is a very important tool to understand how Asia can overcome the legacy of colonialism, or how they overcame the legacy of colonialism in order to come to where they are today. So decoloniality is now the raging force in terms of South scholarship and South ideology or South philosophy. So decoloniality is not decolonization. Decolonization is that the physical struggle, to actually replace colonial rule with post-colonial black-led or African-led governance models. Decoloniality has to do with not just ontology, which means metaphysics of identity, what they call it with epistemology. What is it Africans are grappling with today? Whose ideas are there? If you look at colonialism and its modernity, and even up to postmodernism today, you find that they are actually Eurocentric construct or Euro-Eurocentric constructs on which African leaders are planking development models. But decoloniality simply stop playing the frame of thinking and narrative that has shaped African conversation with Europe and with America. Like American conversation with Europe and America in the past 200-300 years. So decoloniality means how do you evacuate and leverage indigenous mode of knowledge formation in order to find a new pathway to African development. Can Marxism and new Marxist thesis supply this missing link? What you can call a neo-Marxist, even post-Marxist, moment of incarnations? Or is it going to be indigenous models of African development relying less on Western epistemic systems and indigenous knowledge systems to drive Africa? Maybe we have not found it. Maybe when we discuss democracy, it is not democracy we are discussing. Maybe when we discuss elections, not actually elections that really should guide African development, African democracy. Is African democratic practices competitive or cooperative? Is it that you have an independent electoral commission in Nigeria and in other 51, 52 African countries designed loosely around Western models of election management systems and bodies? Is it having political parties of shouting or mouthing different phraseologies in ideology and so on? Then campaign, then people line up and then vote, and then election results are announced, leaders are sworn in. 4 years down the line, new leaders are sworn in. 4 years down the line, new leaders, and they still excreting the same underdevelopment, the same poverty, the same ruinous economic models. So is democracy and its electoral processes, as envisaged by Western liberal democratic managers, the pathway to African development? Maybe it is not. Maybe something new, maybe something more decolonial, maybe something much more epistemic rupture in terms of the way Africans should form their own knowledge. That knowledge should guide their developmental processes. Maybe that is what is missing. But if we can spend all the time in the world and then examine all the different frontiers of African, in underdevelopment today, you can look at conflicts, both conflict induced by scarce resources and so on, and faith. Maybe look at the issue of terrorism and banditry and militancy and extremisms. Maybe look at even the collapse of African institutions, ungoverned spaces. These are very key fundamental problems. But for me, behind these problems lurk a deadly trend that African thought are not African. That African thinking has not been reasonably African in nature. That indigenous modes of reasoning that could produce the kind of vitality for African transformation is lacking. Maybe unless we patch onto that, maybe Africa will never recover.
Yeah, can it also be a problem about the mass, the followership? If you look at all constitutions, they talk about sovereignty belonging to the people, from whom all power must flow. Is it that power does not flow from that, or that people do not sufficiently have a leverage on governance, and therefore everything seems,
It's a very complex, thing, so trying to systematize this kind of articulation the way you put it up brilliantly, will probably lead to some tension between maybe norms and ideology. Maybe the citizens are weak under the understanding that we're dealing with norms. We're dealing with respect of fathers and mothers, respect of institutions of state, respect of the church and mosque, respect of the school, respect of the state, and then observe, and the way you're placed within that democratic system in quotes. That means be a good citizen, register to vote, and then campaign for any party of your choice. These are normative things, but they're not really norms, they're ideological things. Louis Arthurs, who I'm sure you may have run across many decades ago, one of the structuralist Marxists of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s in France, came with this construct of ideological state apparatuses ideology and ideological state apparatuses. He said there is a seamless way ideologies are formed without people knowing it. So people grow up as citizens, the mass which you talk about, believing in something they think is really normal. So what the bourgeois class does is to normalize ideology as norms, which means if you respect the system, you believe in the flag, you raise your hand to the national anthem, it is a norm, but it's ideology. Because the moment you do that, you become a respectful citizen, you're not going to protest against the system. So what the citizens do is to simply accept all these things as given, not knowing that they're rooted in class prejudice. That is why it takes almost 12 years to try a governor who has stolen a lot of money, and then takes 2 weeks to try a good thief, a massacre, and jail him instantly. That is why 95% of those in awaiting trial men's, cells are the poor people from the lower ranks. So law is not actually blind or blindfolded. It is well cited. So law as a blind something that doesn't see class, race, ethnicity, gender is a lie. The law is crafted and designed substantially to reflect the class relations in society, the social relations of production. Say it's our democratic practice. When you pay 100 million or 50 million to contest for the presidency and you can't feed your family, you belong to a party that can never win election. That means it is arranged in such a way that the masses simply say hallelujah to the ruling class. So this is part of the challenge, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa. So until we begin to separate norms, from ideologies and find what ideological apparatuses of the state, of the school, of the church, of the mosque, of social unions, of market associations are all formed to preserve the sanctity and validity of the system. The idea is to how do you topple them with new, fresh ideas that are counter-factual to what you're meant to believe and equally disruptive in reasoning.
Thank you very much. This is Diplomatic Hour with Owei Lakemfa on Citizen 93.7 FM Abuja. And our guest today is Professor Udenka, a solid intellectual, as you can see, and from what you can hear. People, there are a lot of people who think all is lost, and therefore start thinking of other ways, of running society. Some people think this is the reason why you have these recent coups in some countries like Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso. What's your thought on that?
It's actually a systemic crisis, and I don't know whether it's a crisis of structure or crisis of function, or crisis of even identity. But people can reduce to a crisis of governance. That means, where do we derive legitimacy? Is the legitimacy reposed in a constitutional text that in 1999 the constitution was proclaimed, and we said, amen, this constitution is what guided the 1999 elections that produced the 1999, civil transition. Obasanjo was sworn into office 29 May 1999, and so the governors and other members of the organized political class or political elite. So if you have a constitution and periodic elections, the assumption is that you now have a stable democratic system. But there are many other factors that has to come into play in order for that so-called civil democratic governance to work. But if 2 or 3 or 4 election cycles produce similar result, mediocratization of statecraft, incompetence, inefficiency, wastefulness, corruption, mass poverty, conflicts everywhere, how do you solve the problem of legitimacy, the crisis of legitimacy? Is it that the system has to self-correct, or do you need some external intervention? Some people can talk about revolutionary ruptures. That may no longer be possible in Africa today, given so many debilitating factors. So I can talk about mass resistance through mass action that could lead to incremental or fast-paced transformation that could benefit the people. And some can turn into far more dangerous turns, which means coup d'etat as the way to solve this systemic crisis. I don't subscribe to coup d'etat because at the end of the day, the forces that emerge in the post-coup are a reflection of even the bourgeois or the oppressive class already holding society down. So it's like replacing an inefficient, civil model of governance with a more totalitarian, illiberal, khaki mode of governance that does not produce much significant result for the people. So it boils down again to my own thesis. When we speak about democratic transformations in Africa, and then the way these transformations have not yielded the kind of benefits for the people, it are yielded for the elite, whose kids are not schooling in Nigeria or Ghana or anywhere, they are abroad somewhere, who are not impacted upon by 6 months or 1 year ASO strike, who really have nothing to fear in terms of they grow sick or they get sick, they have to get their air ambulance to take them anywhere in the world to treat themselves. So the system has provided well for the elite, but has not provided nothing for the people. So the question now is, if you have a constitution that a parliament is making law based on, and the executive branch is executing policies based on, and the judicial branch is adjudicating conflicts based on, and it's not working, and if electoral processes that are not working, how about African scholars sitting down to talk about the much more philosophical routine or rootedness of these pathologies or these maladies? And that is lacking. It is simply said that the song of democracy is a song for everybody. Just gets it to work, and it's incremental. But it's not working. That's why coup d'etat is occurring in many parts of West Africa. So what our scholars need to do is to really investigate deep into that which we practice. Is that what we should really practice? Is the Chinese model an escape for Africa, or something which we have to mimic more than we've been mimicking the West? Or any other model? Maybe what is going on in Cuba, maybe what is going on in South America today, resurging, the resurgence of left-leaning governments there that are almost saying we can't accept the way the global world order is arranged. The globalization model, in late capitalism is arranged. That's why the colonial theory is becoming very potent. That's why scholars are saying it is not the constitution that may work, it's not even democratic practice, it is the way we think and reason. Who is the owner of our thinking? Who owns our thought? Who owns our narrative? Are these things indigenous enough? Has Marxism an extensive universality that could answer to the indigenous quest for new knowledge? But Marxism is the one that can come closest to it in its reformed form, because like I said, Stalinist unification of Marxism in the pathway of economic determinism may not have told the whole story of Marx and Engels and even Lenin, what they compose in their mind. So if we today liberate our thinking about Marx and Marxism and its functionality in the 21st century world, is it enough to answer to African yearning for a new pathway to thought? If that will happen, do we have a living example in Africa where that has occurred? If that hasn't occurred, when will it ever occur, and under what format will that happen? So I'm really trying to add more questions than I'm even providing answers, comrade, because it sounds something I don't have answers to completely. Yeah. But I have my thoughts about them, and by multiplicity of these thoughts and sharing them in wider formats that could lead to African recovery.
Yeah, you talked about academics and other. So we're looking at institutions, say the universities that are supposed to produce ideas, and the public service that's supposed to help run the states. Why are the judiciary that is supposed to help adjudicate, and why are there problems about these institutions? Why can't they hold out in Africa?
I have not attended so many conferences in the past 5-6 years or so. Yeah. But there's one particular conference I hope to attend in Ibadan, University of Ibadan, in October this year. It's a conference about how to indigenize or Africanize African humanities. It is not in terms of curricular shift. That was what Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the brilliant Kenyan cultural theorist and novelist, did try to do in the University of Nairobi, and they did it at Makerere and so on in the late 60s, 70s, before ultimately he found himself in exile by publishing a book in Gikiyu. He said, I will no longer write in English. That is not the language. The language debate in African literature is very important even today, even in answering your question. I will no longer write in English. I will write in my native Gikiyu, not Kikiyu. He said Kikiyu is a Europeanized way to pronounce my people's name. It's Gikiyu language. So from end of, he developed Petals of Blood, which was the last work he did in English. Everything was written in Gikiyu, Devil on the Cross, Matigari, and so on. So when he wrote Matigari, the news spread that a revolutionary was in the mountains of Kenya, attempted to overthrow the government of Arab Moi. So they went hunting for this Matigari revolutionary force and his band, and discovered to their chagrin that it was a novel written by Ngugi. So they ordered all the books in all the bookstores and burnt them. And the book joined Ngugi in exile. So in a sense, they struggled to Africanize African curriculum to reflect more of Pan-African writers and African, ways of doing things. But this new conference is actually a decolonial conference. how do we begin to create new indigenous faculties, not just in the humanities or social science, but even in the sciences? How do we begin now to shed African humanities as institutions in the academy from overweening influence of colonial and neo-colonial, knowledge stranglehold or epistemic stranglehold? So that's why I made up my mind. I'm going to attend that conference to now listen to refreshing new ideas about how to use indigenous knowledge systems and methods in reformulating, the African, contemporary situation, and then finding the pathway to African recovery. So if you now come to the public service, is a public service authentically African, or is a public service a reflection of a bastardized mode of colonial public service, which we have now corrupted further even to be less productive than even colonial public service? African judiciary, what are the founding, the jurisprudential norms and logics of the Nigerian judicial, neo-African judicial system? Where does this law answer to? Who does it respond to? Who created the mechanisms for judicial, intervention? Who created the concept of people wearing wig and wearing vacuous and fatuous looking, coat and so on, and then dressing almost in a clownish manner in court and say, you are lawyers? Who are you answering to? Even the way manner lawyers appear in court is a reflection of decadence of that judicial, apparatus, and then it means that there's a requirement for us to decolonize and Africanize African judicial systems. So, whether it's the judiciary or the public service or the institutions of the academy, a lot needs to be done in terms of recovering the African essence and African spirit, both in terms of ontology, which means identity of Africans, and in terms of epistemology, which means those tissues of knowledge around which key developmental paradigms are shaped.
Prof, there are some who also say, look, if we're able to understand why we have conflicts, and there are conflicts all over Africa.
There are.
Where the European youths are busy producing, advancing knowledge, a lot of our youths are busy in the forests. So, how do we really bring conflicts to?
It's easy for us to write off the entire hordes of people who have taken arms against the state and class them as one. So classificatory, problems or difficulties impede even methods for conflict intervention or mitigation. That means you conflate the issue of the ISWAP, Boko Haram ISWAP, in the Northeast as virtually the same thing as the terrorist banditry of the northwestern part of the north central, and equate it maybe to the IPOB, ESN, moment in the southeast. Then some remnants of the Niger Delta Avengers and so on, who may well be driving this oil theft that is very aggressive, with elite anyway, and then the Sunday Igboho or something in the southwest. You may now say conflate all of them as one format in terms of conflict study or examination. They're not true. It's not true. So you find out there's, even as reprehensible as Gumi's stance may well appear to some people, it may take the message and not the messenger. You may have to go through a deeper, diagnostics, and from the forensic examination of this banditry in the northwest, and find out where it is rooted and where it is coming from. You can find intersections between banditry and terrorism in terms of the displacement of the cells in the northeast by a very aggressive, sometimes multinational force, implantation there, moving and then contaminating the bandits who may have a different set of ideas in terms of why they're doing what they're doing, into becoming more radical terrorists now. So if you try to now see a linear kind of construct, use the linear construct in studying this phenomena, then you may miss the point. Some of these things are resource-based. Some are issues of dispossession. Some are issues of lack of access to political power, cultural power, and economic power. Some of the issues of marginalization, like you find in the Southeast, where there's a particular government model that seems to be against our people as a consequence of history. We're all prisoners of history. The Civil War was fought and lost. And people are saying, for 50-something odd years, we still feel that we're not really part of this country called Nigeria. The elite may well say we have a lot of investment in Nigeria. We're invested in terms of relationships, partnerships, networking, resources, so we can deal with it. The younger one said, we don't really have anything to deal with. And once you start that kind of agitation, you open the space for other franchises to come in. It could be criminal entrepreneurs, it could be cultic elements, it could be common armed robbers, all masquerading now as freedom fighters across. So we need a lot of tools and flexibility of mind in terms of doing a proper strategic conflict assessment of Nigeria, which we did in Institute 2002, 3, and 4. Published the first ever strategic conflict assessment of Nigeria using the DFID, the British DFID model, which we domesticated with funding from here and there. And then we don't know whether that has been updated over time to reflect these new threats and new conflicts in Nigeria. And so with African countries, Nigeria is almost like a template you can use to study the operation of some of these conflict situations across Africa. My own charge is that in lumping most of these conflicts as one, non-state actors, without examining why they are non-state actors and whose interests they're purveying, we may run a risk of applying wrong, of wrong-headed therapeutics, insulting both either kinetic or non-kinetic therapeutics, insulting on some of these mess Africa finds itself. Finally, globalization, has been praised for its connectivity. In terms of look at the media space, the deterritorialization of media space and democratization of media and so on, but equally implicated as a late capitalist phenomenon, which means from colonialism to new colonialism. Globalization, like a scholar called Frederick Jameson, we talk about being the last phase of late postmodern capitalism. That's what globalization is. That means you find the global north growing in leaps and bounds, and the global south completely delinked and cut off from the sources and means and modes of financial recovery, of economic development, of cultural production. That is why you find hordes of African youths fleeing decomposing post-colonies, either in boats, dying at the Mediterranean, and being watered at Lampedusa, what I call the metaphor of Lampedusa in southern Italy, and then, or Spain. And then you find a lot of them being used for organ harvesting and so on, for prostitution, including child labor and stuff like that. Because the post-colonial states are decomposing. And what they're decomposing is simply because they are linked, from substantive partnerships and substantive networking with global, financial, economic, and developmental forces. So the way the global world is arranged favors the elite across the globe. Billionaires are produced in Africa, they are produced elsewhere. Favors the north against the south, favors the rich against the poor. And once this is accelerating, or has accelerated, the idea is that most African states will be racked by conflict because of lack of resources, to invest in the public service, like education, healthcare delivery system, housing, sustainable livelihood, etc. So these are complex issues that require complex solutions and not simplistic cant, as we find in most African.
Let's look at the issue of terrorism as we witness under ISWAP. How do we contextualize that, and how do we find a solution to it?
Many people believe in Nigeria that a tension already exists between an advertised, in quote, democratic system, which we inherited from post-colonial, from colonial Britain, which means the Westminster model of democracy now transformed into the presidential system of government, we parade now as democracy. That there's already a noted tension between that civilizational model and the theocratic, a putative theocratic model that is embedded heavily in northern Nigeria, which means there is this tension between the Sharia method, the Sharia system, not just as a legal framework, but equally as a way of life, and the so-called democracy. That means any aggressive, resistance to the so-called the civilizational model of Western democracy could lead to extremism or militancy. It's been long there for hundreds of years. So when it happened in Northeast Burundi particularly, it's like the merging of so many currents and forces. It could be urban youth displacement in terms of dispossession and exclusion from politics, economy, and cultural life. It could well be some notion of a distorted understanding of Islamic theocracy that could lead to such an extreme reaction against Western education. It could well be cross-border influences, because you find that the Lake Chad Basin has a lot of countries that converge on it. And when you have porous borders that are not manned, when you have artificial boundaries where people between nations and nations feel as if they're one. Sometimes we rail against Mali and Niger Republic as if they're a distant entity. If you go to northern Nigeria, as I did as a conflict expert in the presidency for years, you can find it comfortably a governor of any of the northern states in Nigeria, northwestern state, telling you that he won't see you this week. Just stay on as my guest. I'm somewhere in Maradi, the other part of Nigeria, visiting my brother governor. There are some consanguinary ties between these entities, because colonialism simply creates artificial boundaries. So once you have free movement of people and goods, you may equally have free movement of arms and drugs and terrorists from the Maghreb, all coming down. And Libya, of course, is implicated. What the Western imperial nation did in Libya 2011 with the death of Gaddafi and the collapse of the Libyan state. And when Gaddafi was known to have had close to 250,000 stateless Africans who were part of his defense forces. Most of these people looted the armories before they fled, and they fled in various directions. Some added to the Al-Shabaab in Somalia, so that some merged with the radical, itinerant forces they find in the Maghreb. Some found their way back to Nigeria, and so on, where they joined up with the Boko Haram franchise. Some developed, all these things came together to create the ISWAP faction, that's opposed to the more indigenous Boko Harams in the group in northeast Nigeria. So if you look at all these things put together, there is no doubt whatsoever that lack of proper governance, efficient governance, poverty in the country, exclusion of the youth, which the youth bulge is very dangerous for Africa. And African populations are mostly young population. And when thousands and millions are produced from schools every year, and then without any prospect of getting a job, and nobody really gives a damn whether they get a job, either they find themselves into court groups, into Yahoo, what they call the internet fraud in a community, or they find themselves into much more dangerous radical organizations. So until we begin to address all this is with scarce and diminishing resources, with the reproduction of leadership that is incompetent and indolent, and with a system that is not actually our own, a democratic order designed to suit the purposes of the elite and the purposes of the West. Until all these things persist, there is surely no way Africa can recover.
Thank you very much. This is Diplomatic Hour with Owei Lakemfa on Citizen 93.7 FM Abuja. And we're speaking with Professor Udenka. Prof.
Comrade.
Was Africa built to fail? Or to succeed?
When is Africa built to fail or succeed? It depends on what we mean by Africa. If it is Africa of the colonial era, then there was no organic design by the colonial, merchants or colonial leaders to create a continent that suited the purposes and the promises of the internal civilizational models already existing before they came. So not as if there was an attempt to leverage on the organic patterns of development to say, here was Africa, or African nations and peoples and ethnic communities when we came to intrude in their space. We understand very well that we're only going to guide this space to grow to its fruition. That didn't occur. It was like a mechanical, almost casual splintering of Africa to suit economic exploitative designs, political oppressive designs, as a way to maintain that economic domination, and then cultural evacuation in terms of repressing our cultural and indigenous ideologies and philosophies. When it creates a continent now like that as a colonial enterprise, then it is designed to fail. But if you look at Africa as Africa, that African civilization in many instances predate Western civilization. If you do understand that Egyptian civilization, from historical accounts, not from any ideological sermon or rhetorical, the narrative, predated, Greek civilization, from where you found the logic of Western, civilizational transformation, and even that Ethiopia predated the Greek the Egyptian civilizational model in terms of where it was in ancient history. Not to talk of many other parts of Africa. Then they discovered that Africa was not built to fail originally. But as I said, if you look at moments of history as a guide, you say, okay, Africa is failing or Africa is designed to fail. But if you look at millennial sweep, that means across thousands of years, what will African future be, African fate be? Maybe Africa will recover its way, which it has lost. Maybe these indigenous models of African reaffirmation, tapping into some elements of Marxist dialectics, that for me is most enchanting in all Eurocentric constructs, because the idea is Eurocentric or Western, but at the same time universal. We used to think about universality or say Marxism before without question. I look at it now in the construct of history of ideas and said, yes, it was primarily a reaction to a Western or European Enlightenment But then it's a project of universal significance that Africa can borrow from because it's the most enterprising and the most progressive when you find in terms of history of ideas and thought. That is why since Marx came, every being, virtually every being, whether the modernists or the postmodernists, structures and post-structuralists, are in a way inflected with Marxist thought. Jacques Derrida, Jürgen Habermas, Foucault, the rest of them, all will tell a claim that Marx was there in their soul, in their heart. Even the construction that people believe deconstructs everything to the level of postmodern thinking says it's nothing but a radicalization of a certain spirit of Marxism. So for me, there's an element of Marxist dialectics that we have to evacuate from that Central European environment and integrate with much more indigenous methods Africa can develop, from our own sources, our own history, in order to really find the right balance for our philosophy, for our ideology, for our governance model, for our so-called democratic practices, and then governance. That may well be the path, but then our scholars need to think. But they can't think when they're out of school, the academy is already decomposing, lecturers are in a state of mental and economic meltdown, poverty is talking, the intellectuals fail, and the ruling, elite are not really bothered. When you don't have the academy, the intellectual class sustained and maintained and taken care of and catered to, no society can transform itself because education will not be search for knowledge. You just need to fulfill, historical moment in which you say you pass a first degree or a second degree, a third degree.
Prof, you are really into cultural development. Is there any way, because you're talking about indigenous thought, indigenous culture, African ways of finding solution? Is there any way we can use African culture to remedy the situation?
Well, broadly speaking, if you look at if you say African culture, people believe that culture may be the mode of dress or the dance steps or the artifacts and the things you see. Culture is very broad. Culture is for me the foundation of the human enterprise, because everything derives from cultural practices and then cultural knowledge. So African culture, broadly speaking, when it accommodates the broad face of philosophy, what we now call cultural studies, aesthetics, and then even the social formation itself, interpreted via culture, may well be the pathway for African recovery. There's a lot of recovery methods, like African literature, when Achebe and Shoinka and their generation, caused an epistemic rupture between colonial literature and then post-colonial literature or decolonial literature, things fall apart, Dance for the Forest, and so on and so forth, is a new form of telling Africa this is who you are. Now, when you talk of the second generation writers in Africa, they are much more radical because they came from that bipolar world of communism, imperialism, contestation, the famous Shofisa, the Tesson Weme, the Neo Shindari, and the rest of them. It comes down to the third generation writers, of the Chimamanda Adichies and the Helen Habilas, and et cetera, et cetera. In fact, that they are even post-national children. They look at African culture from the lens of the globe. Most of them are diasporic people. They stay in the diaspora. So that's one aspect. Literature, music too. You can find that it's the indigenization of African music. Afro beats have come to stay in various forms and manifestations. Look at the Nollywood and the film industry. Again, it's not even a question of, my idea is about phenomenon, not about even the form and the content. Is the content of Nollywood inspiring? Can it drive African development, cultural development, or even beyond African cultural development? But the phenomenon itself is that you go to African homes, you are far more likely to watch African films than Western films. You go to any dance club or any nightclub or whatever, you're likely to listen to African music, and most often Afrobeats. And if you go and read any bookshop, you're likely to read African novels, Nigerian novels now, than going to read any novel from the Western, in a Western canon. So these are forms of cultural recovery, but we need a lot more in terms of political recovery, economic recovery, and philosophical recovery for Africa to really transform.
Prof, the last word or words from you. Is there any chance for social justice in Africa?
There's a chance for social justice in Africa, first and foremost, when we understand what social justice means and who pervades the ideas of social justice and who drives the agenda for social justice. If we don't have a system that is just and they don't have economic method that's equally egalitarian in nature and they don't find a judicial system that is equally cast, its jurisprudence is based on justice, such justice will be difficult to get. Because social justice is just not for the dispossessed classes, but equally for marginal groups. So that is why I believe that it's a totality. It cannot separate social justice from the overweening influence of other forms, of institutional forms or functional forms in Africa. So social justice is but a very potent element that is going to be situated within the vortex of government, politics, economy, and so on.
Prof, thank you very much. This is Diplomatic Hour with Owei Lakemfa on Citizen 93.7 FM Abuja. And we have been speaking with Professor Udenka. Thank you very much, sir.
Comrade, it's a pleasure to have been with you this morning.
Thank you.
And I look forward to these conversations down the line.
Thank you very much.